Good evening, good evening, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, good night to whatever part of the world you are tuned in at. We thank you all so much once again for tuning in to Truth Be Told TV. All we ask that when you come in, you please hit that like button, comment, share, subscribe to our channel. I'm sorry, so that when we go live, you will be notified. Once again, thank you all so much for tuning in. Peace, love, and blessings to the family. I see my girl Vita, Mr. Bays, Lillian, Kish may be busy on today, you all. So, peace, love, and blessings, family. Thank you all so much for holding it down. And us just being a family, y'all. So tonight, you all, I am going to, be up for a minute with you all, coming in the comment section. But Mr. Bass is pretty much going to take over the show tonight for me. He has it. And you all know he gonna handle it now. So thank you all so much once again for tuning in. Hope you all have a blessed weekend as well as your week was positive and just being a blessing to one. So I am about to bring up Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass, where you at, babe?
I'm here, right here.
Hey.
What's going on?
Oh man, I am exhausted.
I hear you. I hear you.
And not to mention, y'all, that's what I'm saying. I need to get me some rest tonight, a little bit at least, because I got a lot of things to do on tomorrow. My tomorrow is gonna be very busy because I got a new living room too. So I'm be dealing with that all day tomorrow. So
Yeah, well, your last 20 days been pretty tight, but we thank God that He is our Lord and our
yes,
Savior.
Lord, and He is so awesome. God is so good. I just thank God for y'all because I'm gonna tell you something. When God put you all in my life, listen, He knew what He was doing, and I didn't know the magnitude of it, y'all. Let me just break it down. I didn't know the magnitude of it, y'all. But remember, I kept telling you all when we were somewhere in hell. I said God is gonna handpick all the ones that needs to be gonna be, and all the ones that are not is gonna what? I said because God is doing a thing. It's not what we're doing. It is what God is doing. You understand me?
Amen.
And fast forwarding it until today. When I tell y'all I love y'all so much, y'all are my family. Listen here. I would go above and beyond. Listen, to make sure my family good. Listen, I love y'all.
We love you, boss lady.
And I just thank God. God is so good. And listen, I'm here to say it. I bet y'all family ain't better than mine. Hey. So shout out to Smitty. Peace, love, and blessings, Smitty. Hey. So Mr. Bass, you already know I'm about to just go in the comment section. I'm finna enjoy the content that you have pulled forward. Now, this content has come from Mr. Bass on tonight that he's bringing you all, and it is very, very informative. Him and V that put this together. So, thank you all, Mr. Bass and Vita and Lillian. Thank you all so much for the content. So, I'm finna just kick back and watch And when I no longer come in or y'all don't hear me, I'm asleep, y'all. But know that I love you all. But as the show is going on, I have to get this prayer in before I even finish doing it, because I've been went to sleep and I'm been to pray, y'all. So okay. Anywho, I love y'all. Thank you so much, Mr. Bass. And I'm finna let you handle it from here. And I'm finna go on dip out. I love you. I love you all. Thank you all for tuning in to Truth Be Told TV. Once again, hit that like button, comment, share, subscribe, so that when we go live, you all will get the notification. Also, Truth Be Told is a family that we will speak and tell the truth, because first and foremost, we are afraid of the Lord, baby. When he said do something, we gonna do it. So once again, thank you all so much for tuning in. Peace, love, and blessing. Thank you, Mr. Bass.
Amen. You're welcome. Peace and blessings, Smitty Quapa. What's happening, my brother, sister, brother? I can't even see the picture, so just forgive me. Looking forward to tonight. We're bringing you more information on what's going on around us and what has been going on for centuries. And we need to be made aware. And a lot of this information you probably already know. And a lot of it, I know a lot of it is going to be new to you. But this was one of the best ones I've seen put together yet. So without any further delay, we will begin.
Social segment tonight. The new payola, a sour note that is tainting the rock music business once again. It was back in the 1950s that payola became a way of life in this industry. Record companies and promoters paying off disc jockeys to plug new releases and to boost sales. Today, the practice appears to be back, with a group of independent promoters playing a major role. And federal authorities are investigating a possible mafia connection.
Just how important the rock music business is to the mafia became clear last month at this New York City hotel. Indicted by a federal grand jury in Newark on racketeering and extortion charges, accused of using violence to get their way in the gambling business, the narcotics business, and the music business.
But it was not his association with Mr. Reagan that Frank Sinatra was asked about yesterday.
Tell the same story Cox does about payoffs of cash, cars, expensive watches, drugs, and nights with women.
The Jimi Hendrix experience is over. The acid rock musician died today in a London hospital, apparently from an overdose of drugs. The death of another rock musician was disclosed today. Jim Morrison, 27 years old, lead singer of The Doors. His manager said Morrison died 6 days ago in Paris, either of a heart attack or pneumonia. But the death was kept secret to avoid a sensation.
Kurt Cobain, the lead singer of the enormously popular rock band Nirvana, is dead at the age of 27. More now from NBC's Brian Williams.
The international music industry is in shock with the death of rock star Michael Hutchence. The body of the INXS lead singer was discovered in a Sydney hotel room late this morning.
The Hollywood coroner says an overdose of narcotics is responsible for the death of the well-known rock singer Janis Joplin. Ms. Joplin was found dead in her bedroom last night.
Exactly what happened inside the iconic Beverly Hilton remains a mystery. Paramedics raced to the 4th floor and found a lifeless Whitney Houston inside her hotel room bathtub.
Both the Los Angeles Times and CBS News are both now reporting that Michael Jackson has died.
I don't think many people at first glance would regard being a popular musician to be particularly deadly, but looking at the data, we see something rather peculiar. According to a study conducted by the University of Sydney, which sampled 13,000 different artists across 7 decades, it was noted that a popular musician's life expectancy was up to 25 years shorter comparable to the general population. Furthermore, accidental death rates were between 5 and 10 times greater, suicide rates were between 2 and 7 times greater, and homicide rates were up to 8 times greater. The study suggests an average life expectancy for musicians that are male to be in the late 50s and women in the early 60s. At first glance, these numbers are hard to contextualize, so let me give you something to compare it to. This is the same life expectancy you'd expect to see for a police officer in Buffalo, which has been labeled the most dangerous city in New York. Or if we're talking about the 90s, a male musician has a shorter life expectancy than a coal miner in China in the 1980s. These numbers make it clear as day that the true price of fame in the music industry is up to 25 years off your life. But that's not to say that fame is this deadly across the board. In another study that sampled 1,000 different notable people from 2009 to 2011 from all professions, they found that those notable for their work in business, politics, or military generally lived longer than the national average, while writers, performers, and other creative types were only noted to have their lives shortened by a year. So what is going on with the music industry in particular? While we've established that the music industry is particularly deadly, the vast majority of the literature on the phenomena seems to isolate this to just one or two things, such as the added stresses from fame or the ease of access to substance, or that creative types tend to be more predisposed to mental illness. While there's no denying that these factors definitely play a role in this phenomena, perhaps there's a bit more to this story. While much of the formal research on this topic scrutinizes what is wrong with the artist as an individual, perhaps it's better in this case to focus on what is going on within the industry as a whole. Because if you focus away from the individual to the industry is something incredibly concerning. Music is one of the few industries on the planet where someone's work is worth significantly more to a company after their passing. Generations are remembered by the art that they leave behind, and the easiest way to be remembered is to be hailed as a legend from that time period. A premature death can take an artist from a good artist to a legend, which can in some cases solidify an artist's recording catalog to be a cash cow for decades to come. Think about this for a moment. When an artist signs his name on the dotted line to a record company,
All right, fam. Sorry about that. Let me see if I can adjust this and get this fixed. Sorry about that, fam. I'm gonna go to the next video and see if I can find another clip with this particular one.
Freemasons. They're the shadowy secret society who's controlling the world behind the scenes. Some of the richest and most powerful people in the world have been members of this order, and they've been using their power to influence and manipulate world events in their favor. At least that's what some conspiracy theorists would have you believe. Depending on who you ask, they're either a cabal of devil worshippers who run the world, or just a club of rich dudes who want to hang out with other rich dudes and drink beer without their wives bothering them. But as with most things, the truth is somewhere in the middle. Freemasons. They're the shadowy secret society who's controlling the world behind the scenes. Some of the richest and most powerful people in the world have been members of this order, and they've been using their power to influence and manipulate world events in their favor. At least that's what some conspiracy theorists would have you believe. Depending on who you ask, they're either a cabal of devil worshippers who run the world, or just a club of rich dudes who want to hang out with other rich dudes and drink beer without their wives bothering them. But as with most things, the truth is somewhere in the middle. I'm Dan Tavius, how you doing? And today we're going to be talking about a Freemason lodge called Propaganda Due, or Propaganda 2, that basically took control of the entire country of Italy. And not only that, but they were involved in several scandals and conspiracies around the world. And let me tell you, I'm not exaggerating when I say this is one of the most insane stories you will ever hear. It involves the mafia, the Vatican, and the CIA.
Nearly 1,000 of Italy's elite, including 3 cabinet members, were allegedly members of an outlawed, super secret, super evil Masonic lodge called
Propaganda Due, or P2.
An illegal, ultra-secret political society of Italian Freemasons. In the 1970s, he inducted almost 1,000 of Italy's most powerful men in clandestine rituals here in Rome's Excelsior Hotel.
Politicians, bankers, and mafiosi met here.
The secrecy of Masonic lodges provided the perfect place to conduct shady deals with figures from the business and political elite.
June 18th, 1982. A postal clerk was headed to his job in London one morning when he noticed something strange in the distance. As he passed by London's Blackfriars Bridge, he saw what looked to be a man hanging by his neck under the bridge. And it turns out that's exactly what it was. The man wore an expensive suit and had a Rolex on his wrist. When police searched the body, they found $1,400 in 4 different currencies and a passport with the name Gian Calvini. Well, it turns out the passport was a fake, and the guy's actual name was Roberto Calvi, a prominent Italian banker who was known as God's banker because of his close ties with the Vatican. His passing was officially ruled a suicide by British police, but it was more of an Epstein situation, but we'll get into that later. Roberto Calvi ran one of the largest financial empires in the world, and a year before his passing away, his entire business collapsed. When investigators looked into it, they found out that our boy Calvi was up to some shady stuff. Fraud, money laundering, embezzlement, the classics. The investigation also led police to a guy named Licio Gelli, a big-time mattress mogul. In 1981, they raided Gelli's house and discovered he was the leader of an Italian Freemason branch called Propaganda 2, or P2 for short. They also found a list of every member of his little club, and the people on this list weren't just a bunch of schmucks. The most powerful and influential people in all of Italy were on it, including Roberto Calvi himself. And if this sounds kind of like the plot to The Godfather Part 3, that's because it is. The movie is actually based on these events. But before we get into all that, let's talk about the history of the Freemasons briefly. But first, a word from our sponsors. I don't know if any of you have noticed, but I lost a little bit of weight recently.
Please clap.
You know, the hardest part about eating healthy for me is that I'm a lazy sack of shit, and a lot of the time I don't feel like cooking, so I just end up eating Chick-fil-A or something. Luckily, I started using Factor. Factor sends delicious, healthy meals directly to your door, so you don't have to waste any more time planning, train, discuss their craft. And let's be honest, a lot of gay stuff probably happened too. Then in 1717, 4 lodges in London joined together to form the Grand Lodge. From its humble beginnings as a couple of schmuck stonemasons, the fraternity eventually grew into an exclusive group of some of the most powerful men in history, including George Washington, Winston Churchill, Colonel Sanders, and Shaq. By the late 1800s, Freemasons were pretty much everywhere to Italy. I cook a pizza, that place. By the mid 1800s, Freemasons and other secret societies had gained a lot of power and influence, even rivaling the Catholic Church itself. It was during again one, the precursor to P2 was formed in 1876. So things were going pretty good for Italian Freemasons for a while until 1925, when a fella by the name of Benito Mussolini came to power. He stomped out anything that could potentially challenge his authority and viewed the Masons as a threat. So during Mussolini's reign, the order had pretty much completely dissolved. And after the fascists lost the war, the Freemasons came back and they had to rebuild their order from the ground up. This provided big opportunities for certain individuals. One of those individuals was Licio Gelli, aka King Cobra. Shit, that's a cool nickname. Gelli took control of P2 in the 60s and turned it into one of the most powerful organizations in the world. At its height, the lodge was home to most of Italy's elite class, and P2 had such a tight grip on the country that it was referred to by many as a parallel government or a shadow government, which it definitely was. They had a hand in pretty much every significant event that happened in Italy in the 70s and 80s, and outside of Italy too. And Licio Gelli was the puppet master who controlled it all. So who was this guy? At first glance, he doesn't look very impressive. Big-ass glasses, goofy-ass smile. There's no way this guy could have been the mastermind behind the secret shadow government. Well, looks can be deceiving. You see, the thing you gotta understand about Gelli is that the dude was a hardcore fascist. And I'm not saying fascist in the modern sense of the word, which is anybody that disagrees with me politically. I mean a real fascist. He was once quoted in an interview was saying, "I am a fascist, and I will die a fascist." Well, I mean, that doesn't leave too much room for interpretation. But, I mean, you got to give it to the guy. He didn't beat around the bush. I bring this up because it's actually a pretty important part of this story. But let's take a look at how this unassuming-looking guy came to his position of power. During World War II, Licio was a big fan of Benito Mussolini. When Italy renounced its alliance with Nazi Germany in 1943, Gelli joined Mussolini and other fascists in the creation of the Republic of Salo, a German puppet state in northern Italy. When the Axis powers were defeated at the end of the war, he fled to Argentina to escape being charged with war crimes, as one does. While in exile, he became friends with Argentina's dictator, Juan Perón, who would later be inducted into the Freemasons by Gelli himself. It's also been speculated that he started working with the CIA around this time. More on that later. After a few years in Argentina, Gelli decided to head back to Italy, where he started a successful mattress company. Then, in 1962, he would officially become a member of the Freemasons, where he quickly rose through the ranks. By 1968, the Freemason leadership decided to make Gelli the head of the once great Propaganda Masonica Lodge, now known as Propaganda Due. But my man Licio had bigger ambitions. He didn't want to just lead some glorified country club where rich old fucks sip martinis and eat gabagool. So he set out to make P2 a force to be reckoned with. Now, in the late 60s to the late 80s, tensions were high in the world. It was a rough time for everybody. The Cold War was going on. Everyone was under a constant threat of nuclear war. But things were especially bad in Italy, where this period was known as the Years of Lead because of the massive amounts of violence and political turmoil. Over the course of about 20 years, there were a total of 8 terrorist attacks, 2 failed coups, and more assassinations than you can count. Well, unless you can count to 400. There was 400 assassination attempts about. And this also happened to coincidentally be the same exact time period that Licio Gelli was the leader of P2. So I think there may be a slight chance that these two things are related. But I'll let you guys decide. Let's take a look at some of the events that P2 were involved with. Allegedly. December 12th, 1969, a bomb goes off at a bank in Milan, taking the lives of 17 people and wounding 88 more. The attack was initially blamed on anarchists because, why not? 80 suspected anarchists were arrested in connection to the attack. During the investigation, one suspect, Giuseppe Pinelli, fell out of a fourth-story window and he didn't make it. His untimely demise was ruled to be accidental, the result of him fainting due to exhaustion and conveniently falling out of the window. The police commissioner who interrogated him was later assassinated in retaliation. It was later discovered that the attack was actually carried out by Ordino Nuevo, or New Order, a far-right neo-fascist group who carried out a similar string of bombings the same year. In 1972, 2 men were arrested in connection with the bombing: Franco Freda and Giovanni Ventura. Now, they were eventually acquitted, but the case didn't get resolved until 2004. And a big reason it took so long is because of a classic case of obstruction of justice. General Giandelio Maletti destroyed evidence implicating the 2 members of Ordino Nuevo, and, the general just happened to be a member of P2. Then we got the Golpe Borghese coup. Giunio Borghese was a member of a prominent noble family. During World War II, he, like Licio Gelli, joined the Republic of Salo and fought for the Nazis. After the war, he was charged with collaborating with Germany and served 4 years in prison. But despite this, he was still pretty popular and considered a war hero by many. After WW2, Borghese went into politics and gained the nickname the Black Prince due to his extremely far-right views. And again, that's a cool-ass nickname. Like, you gotta give it to these fascists. They were good at nicknames. Bad at human rights, but good at nicknames. Borghese was unsatisfied with the growing presence of liberalism and leftism in Italy, so he decided to do the most reasonable thing he can think of and plan a coup to overthrow the government where he would install himself as president. The plan was simple. Step 1, kidnap the current president. Step 2, whack the head of police. Step 3, take over the Ministry of Defense. And step 4, profit. But he couldn't do this alone, so he enlisted the help of a few different groups. First was the New Order that was behind the Piazza Fontana bombing I just mentioned. Then he made a deal with the Mafia, who agreed to help in exchange for leniency once Borghese came to power. And finally, it should be no surprise that P2 was also heavily involved in this plot. In fact, P2 members were the ones tasked with arresting the sitting president, while the Mafia was supposed to whack the chief of police. But then out of nowhere, right when the coup was supposed to go down, like literally the night of the coup, right when everybody was ready for some good old-fashioned cooing, Borghese called the whole thing off. Jeez, man, this is like when you're supposed to go on a date with the girl and you're at the restaurant, she hits you with the, "You're gonna hate me." Now, you may be thinking, well, he had to have had a pretty good reason to call it off right when shit was about to get spicy, right? Well, according to Borghese himself, he called it off because it was raining. I mean, in all fairness, it's dangerous to do a coup while it's raining. Somebody could slip and hurt themselves. By the time Borghese shut the whole operation down, a lot of people had already started carrying out the plan. You guys got to remember, this was the 80s. There was no WhatsApp back then. There was no iMessage. So it took a while for everybody to get on the same page. But, by the time the message got out, it was already too late. The government found out about the plot. And when the time came to charge people for crimes, evidence linking Licio Gelli and fellow P2 members was destroyed by the Secret Service. You'll notice that this becomes a bit of a pattern. As for Borghese himself, he fled to Spain where he would later die of poisoning. Heart attack. He died of a heart attack. Definitely no foul play involved. After being involved in scandal after scandal, the other Freemason leadership decided that Gelli was bringing down too much heat on them.
You said I'm bringing heat on you? I gotta listen to people because of your fucking shit? You're ordering me out? You better get your own fucking army, pal.
So they revoked P2's charter and essentially excommunicated them from the order. Keep in mind that Freemasons at this time were not considered a secret society in Italy, as they were registered with the Italian government. But once P2 was kicked out of the Freemason network, they became a secret society, which was illegal under Italian law. But if you think our boy Licio give a shit about laws, then you got another thing coming. His contempt for laws would become even more apparent when he allegedly kidnapped and whacked politician Aldo Moro, who also happened to be the former prime minister. On March 15, 1978, the ultra-left-wing terrorist group known as the attacked Aldo's car, whacked his bodyguards, and then kidnapped him. While Moro was being held prisoner, the Red Brigades offered to free him in exchange for releasing some of their members from prison. The government declined, and Aldo's body was later found in the trunk of a car. Now, the extent of P2's involvement in this situation isn't clear, but they were definitely involved in some way, because a journalist named Carmine Pecorelli wrote an article implicating P2 in the incident, and he got whacked not too long after. And I wish it ended there. In the summer of 1980, a suitcase bomb exploded at a Bologna train station, taking the lives of 85 people and injuring 200. Two members of a far-right extremist group were charged with the attack, but it turns out they were framed by the deputy director of the SISMI, which is like the Italian version of the CIA. This dude falsified evidence against these two schmucks.
If the instigators of the massacre were never discovered, it is undoubtedly thanks to the maneuvers of this man, convicted for obstructing justice in the course of the inquiry. Licio Gelli, the venerable master of a Masonic lodge known as Propaganda Due.
And that's only a few of the incidents they were involved in, all right? If I included them all, this video would be like 3 hours long. So I just included the most important ones. But this begs the question, why did P2 do all of this? What was the purpose of all this chaos? Well, all this stuff was going down during the very height of the Cold War. Russia and America were fighting for influence, and the spread of communism had to be stopped by any means necessary. In the years following World War II, Italy faced a growing leftist presence. Communism began to gain popularity among the people, and leftist politicians were winning a lot of seats in parliament.
From Borghese's attempted coup to the Bologna bombing, the shadow of Gelli looms large over every despicable news story in latter-day Italy. He was driven by a single motive: to keep the communists away from government, a priority objective for Italy's American friend as well.
So, of course, the CIA decided to get involved. Allegedly. You see, the CIA has a long and rich history of supporting far-right extremists and helping them overthrow democratically elected governments. Like, as soon as there was a hint of communism anywhere, they would do a coup. They were so desperate to stop the spread of communism in Europe that they were willing to team up with anyone. And they did. That's where Gladio comes in. Gladio was the name of a top-secret operation where the CIA funded, trained, and infiltrated European anti-communist groups to counteract the Soviet Union's influence.
One of the primary, indispensable principles of American foreign policy. And that principle is to maintain the necessary strength in the Mediterranean to preserve the peace against those who might threaten the peace.
The original intent of Gladio was to have like a secret fighting force ready in case the communist countries ever decided to push into Western Europe. But it turned into something much darker. Many of the terrorist attacks that happened in Italy during the years of lead were a result of Gladio. Oh, and don't think for a second that the Russians weren't doing the same thing. There was essentially an underground proxy war being fought in Europe between CIA and KGB-backed groups. And P2 was a huge part of this puzzle. Most of its members were former fascists, and they were willing to do whatever it takes to stop leftists from taking over Europe, even if that meant hundreds of people had to die in the process. So they were a perfect ally for the CIA and received a ton of funding and protection. Allegedly, okay? Allegedly. Unproven. But I mean, come on. P2's reign of terror would continue all throughout the 70s and 80s, but as all good things tend to do, this too would soon come to an end. And much like the 2008 financial collapse, it was the banker's fault.
The story of an Italian banker. For a while, he had the Midas touch. He masterminded a financial empire. It enriched fascists and priests, bankers and swindlers. When it finally all crashed, the scandal reached even to the inner sanctum of the Catholic Church. Tonight, the story of the man called God's Banker.
So for this next part, I sourced most of my information from the book God's Bankers by Gerald Posner. So if I quote anything, it's probably from that book. Banco Ambrosiano was founded in 1896 by Giuseppe Tovini, a devout Catholic who was sick of secular banks that fucked over their fellow man. So he set out to create a truly Christian bank that operated ethically, piously, and charitably, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. In 1947, Roberto Calvi started working at Banco Ambrosiano at the age of 26. He was a workaholic and quickly rose through the ranks, going from an entry-level clerk to the director of operations. But he was too ambitious for his own good. Despite having a good job with dental benefits and a 401k, Calvi wanted more. He wanted to turn Banco Ambrosiano into the biggest bank in Italy and was limited by the bureaucracy, so he needed help. That help would come in the form of Michel Sindona, also known as the Shark. Sindona was an international banker who worked for the mafia. This guy was a big freaking deal. He owned several banks all over the world and used them to launder money for the Gambino crime family. He also functioned as a sort of accountant for the mob. Calvi met with Sindona in 1968 and told him, quote, Ambrosiano held large sums of money in the safe. He would like to use that cash in more aggressive ventures with Sindona. The problem was the bank's conservative board of directors was certain to reject it as too risky. After hearing this, Sindona started drooling and his eyes turned to dollar signs. After this meeting, Sindona would introduce Calvi to a few different people, one of them being Licio Gelli, who inducted Calvi into the Freemasons, and another was Paul Marcinkus, an archbishop from Chicago who was a close personal friend to the Pope. A little bit of a sidebar, but Marcinkus was a pretty interesting guy on his own. His nickname was the Gorilla because the dude was built more like a WWE wrestler than a priest at 6'4", 250 pounds. I mean, I could probably still take him, but because of his large frame, Marcinkus served as a bodyguard to Pope Paul VI, who he actually saved from getting stabbed in 1970. And after that attack, the two became very close. So on top of being an archbishop and a bodyguard, Marcinkus was also appointed to be secretary of the Vatican Bank by the Pope himself. Only issue was this man didn't know shit about banking, all right? I know more about banking than he did. Marcinkus met Sindona soon after his promotion because Sindona worked as a financial advisor for the Vatican. Sindona would later say in an interview that Marcinkus was in over his head, inept at financial matters, and not very smart. But despite knowing less about banking than I know about pleasing a woman, Marcinkus was promoted to the president of the entire bank in 1971, just 4 short years after being made secretary. The same year, our boy Roberto Calvi became president of Banco Ambrosiano, probably with the help of Sindona. So now Calvi had some pretty powerful allies on his side. He had the backing of the Vatican, the Freemasons, and one of the biggest bankers of the world. And Calvi didn't waste any time in expanding his empire. He started opening up dozens of secret offshore banks in the Bahamas and creating shell companies in Europe. You know, typical scummy banker stuff. And in a few short years, he was able to make Banco Ambrosiano not only the largest bank in Italy, but one of the most powerful banking organizations in the entire world. Things were going smoothly for a while, but then Sindona started fucking up. In 1972, Sindona, with the help of Calvi and the Mafia, was able to buy the 18th largest bank in the US, Franklin National. And as you guys know, nothing good can come from something named Franklin. So after the acquisition, Sindona starts making a lot of investments in the US and convinces Calvi to do the same. At which point the two of them started making friends with powerful people, like this fella, Richard Nixon. Sindona even donated $5 million to Nixon's campaign. Oh, and after I recorded everything, I found out that Sindona actually owned the Watergate Hotel at the time that Nixon's scandal was going on. So he was involved in that too. After being in charge of Franklin National for just 10 months, his risky investments started to bite him in the ass. The bank was losing millions of dollars and their stock fell by 80%. Which caught the attention of the Security and Exchange Commission, who opened an investigation into Sindona, which revealed that he in fact was not an upstanding businessman, but a scoundrel. The National Bank of Italy also opened up their own investigation at the same time and confirmed that he was in fact a scoundrel and charged him with falsifying accounts and a bunch of other crimes. At this point, Sindona's entire financial empire was crumbling and he went on the run to avoid arrest. Marcinkus was also in the shit because a lot of the Vatican's money was tied up in Sindona's businesses. I'm talking billions of dollars. It was not a good look to say the least. Marcinkus was desperate to cut the Vatican's financial losses, so he basically gave Roberto Calvi carte blanche over the church's investments in an attempt to gain back some of the lost. So Marcinkus and Calvi would get very cozy, with Calvi even placing Marcinkus on the board of one of his banks in the Bahamas. So this story's already pretty insane, but it gets even crazier. On July 11, 1979, Giorgio Ambrosoli, an Italian lawyer who investigated Sindona and discovered all of his shady dealings, was gunned down in front of his home in Milan. Witnesses say the gunman spoke with an Italian-American accent. 2 days later, the chief of police, who was currently investigating P2's connections with Sindona, was also whacked. Then, 10 days after that, somebody else got whacked. This time, the target was Boris Giuliano, the leader of an Italian anti-racketeering task force who was pursuing, quote, credible leads about tens of millions laundered by Sicilian heroin traffickers and disguised as legal transfers through Sindona-owned banks in Italy and Switzerland. After this string of definitely random and in no way connected murders, Michelle Sindona's secretary would get a call from a man who was using a voice changer to disguise his voice and said,
"Sindona is our prisoner. You will be hearing from us."
As the weeks went on, nobody knew if Sindona was alive or dead until Italian police received a letter asking for money in exchange for Sindona's release. But there was one issue. They caught the idiot who delivered the letter on camera. It was Vinny Spatola, a member of the Gambino crime family. A few days after Spatola was arrested, Sindona's lawyer, Marvin Frankel, got a phone call from none other than Michel Sindona himself. He said to Frankel, "I was kidnapped, but I'm free now." He had been missing for a total of 76 days at that point, and he claimed that he was kidnapped by far-left activists. And I shit you not, he also said he had amnesia, like they drugged him the whole time so he couldn't remember anything. All right, I'm going to stop beating around the bush. The dude kidnapped himself. Like, he staged his own kidnapping to win sympathy with the jury for his upcoming court trial. But it didn't work because he got charged with, like, everything. Fraud, racketeering, money laundering, emulating Nintendo games.
I'm playing Mario 3 on my Mac. This time next week, you'll find me in a fucking ditch.
Everything. And it didn't stop there. The FBI also received the tip that Sindona hired a mafia hitman to whack the Italian prosecutor who was after him. And you know who gave the FBI that tip? Henry fucking Hill. Yes, the main character from Goodfellas, the guy who was played by Ray Liotta, gave the tip while he was an informant. So Sindona got charged with that too, along with all the other stuff, and had to serve like 200 years in prison. But during his incarceration, his coffee was poisoned with cyanide, and he passed away. R.I.P. So now Sindona's out of the picture, but he was only the first domino to fall. The whole scandal brought a ton of heat onto Calvi and Marcinkus. Italian authorities were now aggressively investigating Calvi's business dealings, and it wouldn't be long before they found a metric fuck ton of dirt. He was illegally moving money out of the country, embezzling funds, manipulating currencies, laundering money, basically anything bad you can do as a banker, this guy was doing. And on top of all that other stuff, there was hundreds of millions of dollars that just went missing, just disappeared into thin air. It was later discovered that a lot of these funds were sent to right-wing paramilitary groups in South America that were trying to overthrow left-wing governments.
But an ABC News investigation shows that much of the missing money was funneled to right-wing Latin American political leaders and organizations in a major operation to solidly establish the bank as an international financial institution and to stem what the promoters of the project perceived as the rise of communism in Latin America.
And he was using the Vatican to do all his dirty work. So here's what the scheme was. Calvi was essentially using the Catholic Church to hide where his money was going. Since the Vatican wasn't under as much scrutiny as regular banks, they would use it to funnel money to shell companies in the Bahamas and Panama without anybody noticing. So for example, Calvi would deposit $10 million in the Vatican's bank. He would then use that money to buy stocks. He would transfer those stocks to his shell companies, after which they would increase in value. Then he would continue transferring that money to other shell companies owned by Calvi. And the more that these shares circulated, the more value they would gain. And eventually they would get sold again on the Milan Stock Exchange for way more money than what he bought them for. And the whole time this was going on, Marcinkus would make sure nobody within the Vatican itself knew about the schemes that they were cooking up.
The players in this complicated jigsaw puzzle could fit into a spy novel. Calvi, president of Banco Ambrosiano, who became known as God's banker for his financial dealings with the Vatican. Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, the former Cicero, Illinois parish priest, who became the confidant of popes and the president of the Vatican Bank. Licio Gelli, the founder and Grand Master of the now outlawed right-wing Propaganda 2, or P2 Masonic Lodge. His chief aide, Italian lawyer Umberto Ortolani. And Michele Sindona, the man who originally brought together the elements of this jigsaw puzzle and ironically provided the first evidence to ABC News of where the money went.
Eventually, Calvi was charged with fraudulently moving $20 million out of the country and got sentenced to 4 years in prison. But before he got locked up, he used a disguise and a fake passport to flee to London. After about a week on the run, Calvi would be found under the Blackfriar Bridge in London with a nylon rope around his neck and 12 pounds of bricks in his pockets. British investigators ruled that Calvi had hanged himself. Yeah, so did Epstein, huh? It was pretty clear that Calvi was whacked because he screwed up and he knew too much. He was a liability to not only P2, but also the Mafia and the Vatican, so he had to go. The fact that he was found under the Blackfriar Bridge was not random. The members of Propaganda 2 were also known as Blackfriars, so it was basically a show of force. It was their way of subtly saying, yeah, we did this. What are you going to do about it, bitch? Kind of based, honestly. Now, Licio Gelli was actually on the run at the time of Calvi's passing. See, when Sindona got pinched, investigators were able to find a paper trail linking him to Gelli. So they searched his villa in Milan and hit the jackpot. The man was a certified hoarder and had thousands of incriminating documents, including evidence of bribing politicians, blackmail, extortion, and obstruction of justice. He even had a naked picture of Pope John Paul II in his safe. I'm not even kidding. But the most significant thing that was found during this raid was a list of every member of Propaganda 2. Pretty much anyone who was anyone was a member of this club. Sindona and Calvi, of course, were in it, but also the 3 heads of Italian intelligence agencies, the owner of the biggest newspaper in Italy, mafia members, politicians, bankers, army generals, policemen, even fucking Mario was probably a member. Do you guys understand how insane this is? Like, imagine if the CEOs of Chase and Wells Fargo were in a secret group with the heads of the CIA, FBI, and NSA, and the owner of the Wall Street Journal with multiple politicians. He escaped to Switzerland, where he was arrested after trying to withdraw $50 million, and they put him in jail. But he escaped and fled to South America, where he would spend the next 5 years. Eventually, though, he got bored or something and gave himself up. While he was on the run, Italian authorities were building a case, and this man's file was thicker than your mom. Prosecutors were going after him for the Bologna train bombing that I mentioned before, in addition to the whacking of Roberto Calvi, funding extremist groups, obstructing justice, and of course, bank fraud. But after all was said and done, the only thing they got him on was obstruction of justice related to the Bologna train attack, right? The Italian intelligence guy who falsified evidence was a member of P2 and did that at the request of Gelli to turn attention away from their organization. So he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. On top of that, he was also found guilty for financial crimes related to Banco Ambrosiano. Pretty much all the other charges were dropped and he received 18 years in prison. When Gelli heard that he wasn't going to get off scot-free, he ran away again. This time he went to France, but police caught up to him pretty quickly. Even after all that, he had to serve, I think it was a total of 20-something years in prison, but spent the rest of his life on house arrest in his beautiful Italian villa. Like, they basically sentenced him to retirement. The dude was like 83 years old. Oh, and whatever happened to Paul Marcinkus, the head of the Vatican Bank?
3 independent bankers appointed by the Vatican judged that Marcinkus was a victim. He was calmed. Since it's a sovereign state, he is out of reach of Italian investigators. The question of how much Marcinkus knew of Calvi's operation is central to the rest of our story. Certainly, even after being burned by Sindona 8 years ago, Marcinkus stayed in his job and kept on doing business with Calvi.
Well, Italian authorities decided that the Vatican was out of their jurisdiction, so the Pope relocated him to Arizona, where he spent the rest of his life playing golf. But hey, at least he wasn't diddling kids. Gelli passed away in 2015, but one thing's for sure, this evil Keebler elf-looking mother sucker permanently changed history. Many of the people who were in power in Italy to this day were affiliated with P2. The longest-running prime minister in Italian history and current member of European Parliament was a member of P2. It just goes to show that a small man can cast a huge shadow. Also, researching this made me realize that it's not Jews who control the world like all those knucklehead conspiracy theorists say. It's Italians. But anyways, I hope you guys found this story as interesting as I did. As you can see, I wasn't exaggerating how crazy it all was. If you want to see more stuff like this, please like the video and subscribe with notifications on so you don't miss anything. And shout out to all the patrons who subsidize my lifestyle of smoking cigars and driving Bugattis. Also, please check me out on other social media. It's all in the description of this video. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching. God bless.
As a legend from that time period. A premature death can take an artist from a good artist to a legend, which can in some cases solidify an artist's recording catalog. to be a cash cow for decades to come. Think about this for a moment. When an artist signs his name on the dotted line to a record company, the record company will in many cases own all of the masters for the songs recorded under that contract. And when an artist signs to a major label, it's safe to say that their death is in many ways factored into the initial investment. And in many ways, after an artist has peaked in popularity, there becomes an awkward point in their career where the artist is worth more to them dead than alive.
Mad at him due to the business that he did.
Yeah.
And I can't even say mad is that they didn't have a part of it. Let's be real. I'm gonna say it out there straight for everybody listening. My uncle didn't die. He was murdered. I feel the same thing about Prince. We're losing a lot of stars because you have to remember, these are basically insurance policies. When he dies, whatever was owned by the company reverts back. We're not talking about $100,000. We're not talking about $1 million. We're talking about billions of dollars. Notice that when my uncle dies, why do you hear all his music? Why is there a Motown cartoon out now? Okay, well, obviously when my uncle was alive, he wasn't giving the rights to anybody. But when he dies, all of a sudden,
It's pretty incredible to me that all of us have kind of heard this anecdote about musicians dying at a young age, but every time this happens, nobody casts an ounce of skepticism about this kind of thing, or how much these people are worth dead. That, in my opinion, is the true dark side of the music industry. And it seriously does not help that social media in the modern day has made artists' deaths even more lucrative. As one Nielsen executive had stated in 2016, if Earth, Wind & Fire's Maurice White passed away 10 years ago, you might have read about it in a paper and then waited until there was a store open, he said. Now the news cycle travels extremely fast, and you get more awareness. The instant gratification is there. You can buy it or stream it, and it magnifies the consumption. Now, instant gratification is definitely an interesting word choice from this Nielsen executive, especially considering some of his other comments in the same article. This was different from other years, Dave Bakula, Nielsen's senior vice president of industry insights, told the Post. The news cycle is very viral. I've never seen a year like this before. The number of big-name artists passing away. The music industry is getting an extra boost from the celebration, he added. Notice that the author of the article here had to add this for context. But obviously I am nitpicking a bit. All of you probably know what this executive is talking about. Whenever an artist passes away, everyone comes out to show their respects on social media, and this effect has an uncanny ability to run up sales numbers. While in recent history it's been labeled the Prince effect, we have known for quite some time that an artist's passing can be lucrative. But just how lucrative it is, we are just now getting to measure the effects more closely in the modern day. One paper titled Music, Death, and Profits lays this all out for us. Notably, this was the first study of its kind to show the long-term effects of this phenomenon. In their study that monitored 81 artists who passed away from 2015 to 2017, they found something pretty disturbing. Our findings show that a rate of sales does not return to pre-death levels, but instead is in most instances persistently higher even several years after the death shock occurs. Album sales leapt a staggering 226% on average, just on the day the artist died, and they doubled overall on average for the first 100 days. For bigger artists like Prince, the effect was even more pronounced, as he saw a 16,000% increase, while other large artists saw very staggering numbers as well. Furthermore, looking at the album sales for other rappers who have died young, we see that almost all of them see commercial success they never saw in their own lifetime. As if the financial incentives weren't already way too far in the wrong direction, this actually gets a hell of a lot worse. Because there's a clause in record contracts that allows record labels to cash in even more after an artist's passing. This has been going on since the early days of the music industry, and it's quite literally a standard practice. It's called the death clause, or the non-performance clause. Now, this is one of those lesser known details in regards to record contracts, but the former manager of the Grateful Dead, Hank Harrison, wrote about this some years back. Essentially, it goes something like this. Company shall have the right to secure insurance equivalent to 10 times the estimated value of the artist's earnings from any source of revenue for company's sole benefit. Company shall be allowed to employ any insurance carrier or combination of the same to assure this benefit and need not consult or require signature compliance from the artist. Company shall keep such information confidential, except that the company may disclose information to the applicable insurance carriers or as required by law. Artist or artist's estate shall have no right to review or claim the benefit of any such policy obtained by the company. And to quote what Hank Harrison later wrote in this article, he states, "In short, here is what a death clause does in my humble opinion. If an artist fails to perform or pay back advances, the artist becomes more profitable dead. Today, the hit clause still exists, but it is more subtle, and whereas it used to be worth thousands, it's now potentially worth billions. Labels invest millions in new talent, and the insurance policy is a protection against loss or a way of collecting projected profits for music, t-shirts, books, foreign rights, and everything else in all forms." Now, I want to clarify one thing here about the death clause. And it's that this type of life insurance, also known as key man insurance, is actually a standard practice in other industries as well. And depending on how you look at this, it's honestly just a smart business move given how much money they invested into them in the first place. But normally when an employee dies in other industries, there is a pretty significant loss of revenue. And this insurance is designed to make it so the company can stay afloat until they find a replacement. But in the music industry, this is just them double dipping. Now, in case you're unfamiliar, record deals are structured like a loan, also known as an advance. A certain amount the artist gets to keep for living expenses, and the rest will usually get poured into the cost of making an album as well as marketing it. While the specifics will vary from deal to deal, the premise is pretty much the same across the board. Only after the label is paid back in full will the artist receive any royalties on the music recorded during that time. And assuming all goes well with the contract, the process will repeat with a new contract and new debt. If they don't succeed, though, or paying back the label is taking too long, or the artist is trying to get out of the deal, then the death clause conveniently helps the label collect. What's more, as bad of a reputation as record labels may have, they aren't the only ones with perverse incentives. The artist also has to consider that his own loved ones might be out to get him as well, presuming any family members may be included in their will. And if that wasn't bad enough, it has become a far more common practice for artists nowadays to sell parts of their recording catalog on brokerage sites like Royalty Exchange. And I'm just going to flat out say this right now, it's only a matter of time before something bad happens with one of these Royalty Exchange platforms. As one article from MarketWatch stated, buy some of the rights to a rock star's music and you're likely to see a big bump in your royalties if he or she dies suddenly. It creates some awkward incentives. Don't be surprised if this turns up as the plot to a Hollywood thriller sometime soon. So yeah, nowadays, basically an artist has to worry about literally anyone and everyone potentially having a price on their head. Now that you're aware of what a death clause is, I think it's important that I give you a textbook example of this so you can see how this usually plays out. And just know for now, while we will discuss many other mysterious deaths in the music industry later on in this video, for now I'd like to draw your attention to the story of Bobby Fuller. After Fuller moved to LA in 1964, he was signed to a record label by the name of Del-Fi Records, owned by producer Bob Keane. Keane was also the band's manager, and given the fact that it was called the Bobby Fuller 4, Bobby was the frontman. Shortly after the band had scored several hits like their cover of I Fought the Law, on July 18, 1966, Bobby's success in the music industry would be cut short. After receiving a mysterious phone call in the early hours of the morning, Bobby was believed to have left his Los Angeles apartment at 3 a.m. Before Bobby left, road manager had been favored, might have been going to see a girl named Melody that night. After heading out from the apartment, he took his mother's Oldsmobile and he would set off into the night. As the day turned to morning, Bobby failed to meet up with the other members of his band for rehearsal later that day. Around 5 p.m., a couple other visiting musicians had come to see Bobby at his apartment. They claimed that when they were driving up, Bobby's mother's car was not there. Bobby's mother, Lorraine, also noted this. She had been keeping an eye out all day for Bobby to come home. After the two visitors came into Bobby's apartment, Bobby's mom then went to go get the mail. To her surprise, the car was there. Upon closer inspection, she found Bobby lifeless inside of the car. He was found lying across the seat, where the entire car reeked of the smell of gasoline. There was a 2.5-gallon gas can found below the driver's seat, and a gas hose was also found nearby. Upon discovering Bobby in this state, Lorraine called the police. And when they arrived, they took a quick look at the body, and they ruled that Bobby had taken his own life from drinking gasoline. The authorities quickly discarded the gas can and called it a day. The car was never dusted for prints. The police didn't interview anybody, and all in all, it was an open and shut case. Later, it would be revealed through the autopsy that there was no gasoline found in Bobby's stomach, where the coroner later stated that Bobby had died due to inhalation of gasoline fumes, classifying Bobby's death instead as an accident, a finding that nobody, not least his own mother and family, agreed. Multiple witnesses noted that it appeared that Bobby had been beaten up badly and had a broken finger. There was blood found on his shirt and face. Multiple witnesses, including Lorraine, also made the comment that it looked like he had been dragged on the ground, and his body showed various scrapes and injuries. The coroner claims that they were mistaken. He claimed he found no bruises, no broken bones, and no cuts, or evidence of a beating. Instead stating, body in full rigor, skin slip due to high temperature in car. Bobby's body had been found in a full state of rigor mortis, meaning that he had been dead for some time. Considering that the car hadn't been in the lot for more than 15 minutes, this quite literally made it impossible that he could have driven up on his own. And given the sheer amount of gasoline found in the car, it appeared that someone had been just moments away from setting it ablaze. According to an article from Spin magazine, in 1983, Rick Stone reported that he was sure Bobby's head had been doused with gasoline. To this day, Jim Reese maintains that he saw a half-burned book of matches and a burn on the vinyl of the backseat of the car. Assuming the car failed to light, this meant that the persons responsible were lurking nearby. Rather interesting when you factor in that Bob Keane just so happened to magically appear at the scene within moments. Now, Bobby's story is essentially a cautionary tale of what can happen in the music industry. And to quote Rod Crosby, the lead singer for the band The Intruders, Bobby Fuller was vulnerable by virtue of his honesty and naivety. If he had been a streetwise, bitter person, maybe he would have survived. He lived on a high plane of idealism and fantasy. He was swept into the maelstrom of rock decadence and was a victim of a ruthless business. Essentially, Bobby had become worth more dead than alive behind the scenes. He had a life insurance policy taken out on him for about $850,000, while all the other members of the band had policies at around $100,000 each. In the days before his death, the band was on the verge of breaking up. One member was getting ready to return to his family after touring. Another member was likely to have been drafted into Vietnam. Infighting was rampant, leading to Bobby replacing one of the members, and the two musicians from earlier were new potential replacements for his current band. Essentially, Bobby Fuller had had enough of his management, between them failing to fulfill orders for his recent single, and the fact that Bob Keane had been micromanaging their sound, often making artistic decisions which led to their worst financial failure, the Magic Touch, which in spite of heavy promotion through payola, it still was not a commercial success. But that wasn't the only financial problem going on behind the scenes. The label had wanted Bobby to continue touring. He decided to bail on that. Had Bobby walked away, the label would have presumably incurred a large financial loss between the recent failure of the Magic Touch and the tour that was cut short. But if he were to conveniently die in an accident, let's say a mysterious car fire, then the label could easily turn a profit. Had the coroner ruled it being self-inflicted, the label would not have been able to collect, due to a common clause in life insurance policies. Then in the months after, the coroner switched the death ruling to an accident. Conveniently, this was the most lucrative outcome for the label. Now, clearly there was something off about the way the police and the coroner handled this case. I add that the police have now refuted the timeline of events I've shared with you. But if you are a frequent viewer of this channel, you know that all too often when you see this type of behavior from officials, it's usually a pretty big hint that you're dealing with matters pertaining to organized crime. Additionally, in Bobby's case, when 2 private investigators were hired to look into his death, both of them quickly quit the case. Both refused to talk to the press, and one had claimed that they had been threatened. In the days after Fuller's death, 3 mysterious tough guy types showed up outside the apartment of another band member, Jim Reese. They had essentially broken into his apartment only to find that he wasn't there. Jim to this day swore he had no idea who they were, but it definitely concerned members of the group to the point that they were thinking that they could have been next. Where there's smoke, there's usually fire. So were there any ties to organized crime? Many sources on this subject bring up the silent partner in Bob Keane's business, a man by the name of Larry Nunes. Larry Nunes was essentially the man financing Fuller's career, and Nunes was the actual beneficiary who was set to cash in on Fuller's death. Now, the key word here is silent partner. Organized crime is notorious for using frontmen for almost all of their business dealings, and to quote the Chicago Tribune, as the schemes got more complicated, mobsters needed the help of lawyers, politicians, and frontmen with relatively clean criminal records. It was a Faustian bargain. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the term Faustian bargain, it essentially means a deal with the devil. Throughout history, there have been a number of Faustian bargains. But in present day, you'll notice that almost every person who claims this comes from the entertainment industry.
You're still out here doing these songs, you know, you're still on tour.
I do, but I don't take it for granted.
Why do you still do it? Why are you still out here?
Well, it goes back to the destiny thing. You know, I made a bargain with it, you know, a long time ago, and I'm holding up my hand.
What was your bargain?
To get where I am now.
Should I ask who you made the bargain with?
with the chief commander.
On this earth?
And this earth, and then in the world we can't see.
Now, I should also let you know that Bob Dylan has quite literally been playing a never-ending tour since 1988, adhering to a heavy booking schedule of 100 shows a year. He crossed 3,000 shows in 2019. And despite him being 80 years old, his vocal performances becoming unpredictable, and him randomly changing the lyrics of his songs on a night-by-night basis to the point that they become unrecognizable, he's still touring. It sort of makes you wonder if there's something preventing him from retiring, especially given the fact that the overarching data on this industry shows that most musicians don't live to the age of retirement. But to be fair, perhaps he just really likes playing shows still, or perhaps he was saying this for publicity. And to be clear, I'm not accusing anyone of anything. There's definitely a lot of interpretations for this deal with the devil analogy, but all you need to know for now is the fact that at least one of these interpretations includes making a deal with the underworld. And going into this next section, I want to say that we will tie up the stories with Bob Keane and Larry Nunes and Bobby Fuller here in a bit. But for you to really see how the death clause fits into things, you need to understand the entanglements between organized crime and the music business. So we're going to explore a few of those, because Fuller's case is far from an isolated incident.
Tonight, the first of 5 segment 3 reports on what we have chosen to call crime rock. There's a lot of corruption in the music business because there's a lot of money in the music business, in records, cassettes, and in live performances. That kind of money attracts all kinds of unsavory characters who don't know much about music, but do know a lot about crime. Brian Ross reports.
Police say much of the trouble for Earth came from this man, Joe Ulo.
a reputed mob enforcer from New York, who moved to California a few years ago and moved into the rock music business. One of his first targets was Rare Earth. In 1969, Rare Earth was on top. Its first album, a double platinum record, selling more than 2 million copies. The good times, the hit albums, and the big money only lasted for 3 years. And then, Rare Earth began having trouble paying its bills and traveling expenses. Police say that's when Ulo and the mob moved in.
When a band or a management company band run into trouble financially, that's when they come in. And they are heavies. And they'll promise you anything in the world and say that we'll give you whatever you need, we believe in you, blah, blah, blah. But meanwhile, they have to have a percentage of the business. And I'm talking about loan sharking and all the way down the line.
By 1976, Ulo was boasting to his associates that he had taken over a hidden interest in the rock group Rare Earth by providing mob money and mob muscle to take care of Rare Earth's debts. But the mob's backing did little to help the group's music. Rare Earth's records didn't sell well, and the group that had once made millions was almost out of business. Peter Orlbeck, the group's drummer, says he was getting visits at home from strangers who wanted to know if he was hiding any of the group's money.
You see, we were 6 guys that were creating lots of money in which lots of people were enjoying. And we were a motor. And all of a sudden, the motor stopped running. And when a motor stopped running, it started affecting a lot of people. So you don't know what's going to happen.
Joe Ulo was arrested last year for the murder of former basketball star Jack Molinas. And police say members of Rare Earth are lucky no one got hurt. It was a different story for the Three Dog Night. And police also are investigating Ulo's relationship with this rock group. The accountant for the group was shot in the arm and paralyzed in what police believe was a mob dispute over control of Three Dog Night. The group has since broken up, and police are still investigating the shooting. The members of Rare Earth say what happened to them could happen to any rock group trying to make it big in the rock music world.
Anybody that makes a lot of money, they're susceptible to being come on to by certain people if they run into money problems and if they're not smart enough to handle it all.
And that kind of thing can shut down a group.
Oh, instantly. Instantly. Because then the group, if a group becomes paranoid of their safety in any way, shape, or form, you can't go write a song. I mean, you have to have total relaxation and feel good about yourself in order to write good material that people accept. I mean, it comes through in the music. You can see it, you can feel it, and you can sense it.
This example with Rare Earth is probably one of the most common hidden arrangements. Art is known for drawing in people with an interest in money laundering, and given how risky it is to invest in musicians, many narcotics traffickers use artists as a way to launder dirty money, and if the musician succeeds, then that's an added bonus, which can be used to make even more money if they're able to go on tour. In Rare Earth's case, it was more notably an example of loan sharking, but there's honestly no shortage of examples I can give you from history. There are a lot of bands that were made off drug money. For example, the largest manufacturer of a substance that starts with L and ends in SD was the financier behind the band The Grateful Dead. Had it not been for him, they largely would have never succeeded. In the present day, many DJs are just fronts for selling narcotics. And you'll often see that rap groups are often fronts for illegal activity, but that's not to say that gangsterism is exclusive to rap in any capacity. Frank Sinatra, for example, was known to have been a mob-connected musician, one of the most successful, largely due to his mob ties. While never prosecuted because they could never build a case against him, he was known to have been close with many famous mobsters like Sam Giancana, the legendary mob boss of the Chicago outfit for a time, as well as reputed mob boss Lucky Luciano, the first mob boss of what would later become the Genovese crime family. When Sinatra first started in the music business, he had rose to prominence singing in Tommy Dorsey's band. After his notoriety outlived the band's usefulness, Sinatra was stuck in his contract with Dorsey. The story allegedly goes that Sinatra's management offered $60,000 at first to get him out of that contract, but when Dorsey refused, Sinatra turned to his godfather, Willie Moretti, the New Jersey underboss of the Genovese crime family. Rumor has it he threatened him, and curiously, Dorsey let him out of that contract shortly after for $1. You see, Sinatra had to be watched closely by the powers that be. He had political influence, wealth, and close business dealings with very powerful people. This is why you'll notably see a lot of references to Sinatra in rap music. But this arrangement isn't just found in the American music industry either. In research pertaining to cartels in Mexico, music management is listed as a risk-tolerant method of money laundering. And on top of that, to quote this paper, it is unclear whether the music groups participated willingly or under duress in this scheme. In one version of events, groups were targeted by the organization that forced them to participate, in addition to paying extortion quotas. However, an anonymous music industry expert revealed that some groups that had yet to become popular accepted organization money in exchange for producing records and writing songs that praised the organization. Once the music groups became popular, they could participate in the scheme because they could go on tour. In this sense, the organization would invest in lesser-known groups in the hopes that the songs would become popular and allow them to go on tour. This arrangement was unstable, according to the music industry expert, because once a group becomes famous and no longer needs the capital from an organization, it may seek to pursue an independent music career. However, if a group or any members of the group tried to sever ties with the DTO, they were often executed.
Our segment 3 this evening, part 2 in a series of 5 on crime in the rock music business, or how in some cities they might but don't advertise a rock concert brought to you under the auspices of a band of hoodlums. There is so much money in it, so many guitar players becoming millionaires in their 20s, gangsters have seen an opportunity and moved in, as reported now by Brian Ross.
This is Jerry Michelson, a rock concert promoter in Chicago.
By the way, you ready for this?
This is Arnie Granite, Michelson's partner.
Melissa Manchester just canceled her whole tour.
As rock promoters, they expect problems. Last-minute cancellations, managers, agents, temperamental rock groups.
For the marquee tomorrow night, we cannot fit fabulous poodles across the marquee.
But what they never expected was trouble from the mob, and that they would have to turn down concerts because of the people involved. And in the summer of 1977, Michelson and Granite turned down an offer to be part of promoting 3 of the biggest rock concerts ever held in Chicago. This is Soldier Field, and the 3 big concerts held here were called the Super Bowl of Rock, with estimated ticket sales of well over $2 million, and the biggest names in rock music appearing. A federal grand jury is now investigating allegations that the mob ran these concerts, suspected of bribing city officials to get an exclusive on concerts in Soldier Field, booking rock groups through frontmen, and driving up the price of concert tickets, all part of a huge mob scheme to make big money in the rock concert business. One of the men under federal investigation is Victor Comforti, last photographed 20 years ago when he appeared before the McClellan Senate Rackets Committee. Comforti works out of this heating and air conditioning on Chicago's west side. A number of rock concerts from around the country are believed to be close to Comforti, and federal investigators say this garage has become an important meeting place in the rock concert business. Terry Bruner of the Chicago Better Government Association investigated the concerts. He says Comforti was the godfather of the Soldier Field concerts.
He goes way back in the history of organized crime in Chicago. And I think that it's pretty clear that he was the person who was the go-between between the rock promoters and the city officials who were concerned. If you talk to enough people in the entertainment business or the rock business, they're going to tell you that this kind of thing goes on all over the country and that they know ahead of time. We're not even going to bother with Chicago. There's too much hassle, as they say. And I think that's a code word for you've got to pay off. And I think that it's pretty clear that these people had to pay off in the city of Chicago.
One of the people who says he was a victim of the mob scheme at Soldier Field in Chicago is rock superstar Ted Nugent. Police estimates based on aerial photographs of the crowd at Soldier Field were that as many as 90,000 people were in the stands. But the promoters told Nugent there were only 56,000. And Nugent says he was cheated out of more than $100,000 in his percentage of the ticket sales.
You lost a lot of money there, didn't you?
Well, again, it's hard for me to walk away from a gig making $250,000 and realize that I lost money. But yes, the people paid to see Ted Nugent. Ted Nugent should get his money.
You consider yourself an honest businessman?
Oh, totally.
Do you, though?
Yes.
Has that hurt you in this industry?
I would say so. I would say that it's definitely hurt us being honest and operating in an honest way.
It is difficult. Over the years, there's been times when it's been difficult. We've had to make hard decisions like that.
not to make a payoff, not to skim, not to cheat?
Yeah, those decisions have had to be made. There's been easy money out there at times. There was ours for the taking.
In this hall in Nebraska, it is still possible to put on a rock concert without the mob. But in Chicago, and in a number of cities in this country, promoters, managers, and rock stars have to go along with a lot to put on a rock concert.
Now, this type of criminal entanglement, just like many others going forward, you're going to notice a trend. There are examples of corruption from the very beginning, and there are also examples of circumstances in the modern day. For example, many nightclubs and many concert venues are just fronts to launder dirty money as well. There's no shortage of articles that you can find nowadays about venues getting busted. But this goes far deeper than that. So let's start with Coachella. One of the largest, most famous, and one of the most profitable music festivals in the United States and the world. That was started by one of the biggest traffickers of the devil's lettuce in California, Gary Tovar. His promoter called Golden Voice Productions. And he would take losses on paper, but launder his money through the promotion business. And the shows would give him a cover to also sell more product. Now, there's something very interesting that happens when a venue becomes a front for illegal money. Assuming the management doesn't skim from the artist, and there's some actual honest business going on, relatively speaking, the bands actually get paid very well. To quote an article from OC Weekly, the singer of TSOL, Jack Grissom, explained, "When he started paying us more than anyone else in the country would pay us, I mean, it pissed people off. Gary really started paying these bands what they were worth. We'd play a show, and the show would be packed, and a band would get $100 or $200. Gary was the first punk promoter who actually paid what they deserved. Well, if we all got what we deserved, we'd all be in jail, but it was unlike any other promoter. Everyone wanted to be on Gary's shows, and it only was a short time before he was the biggest promoter around." Now, I can only speak for what is available online, and there's actually a lot of positive stuff said about this guy. Like, he helped a bunch of bands get started, he would fly them out, he took a lot of losses, he was very generous as well. In fact, even when the feds busted him in 1991, a bunch of the groups that he had promoted early shows for would go on to thank him by doing a banquet to raise money for his legal fees. And he was known for promoting a bunch of bands like Red Hot Chili Peppers, Jane's Addiction, Nirvana, as some of their earliest shows, all before they were widely known. Now, obviously, business is good in, but in 1998, he was released, and a year later, they would go on this one big music festival. While Tovar was no longer the owner, he did join back as a consultant, as he had previously signed over ownership to his employees. Because Tovar was relatively generous with his front business, unlike many others in this industry, it inevitably led to Coachella becoming a success. Now, this one is a surprisingly positive one, given that the industry's history reads like a hall of rogues. But in reality, I had to restore your faith in humanity for a bit just to talk about this next character. Because when it comes to the shady business of music venues and nightclubs being used as fronts for illegal activity, this goes back to the emergence of organized crime in America. In the 1920s, the outlawing of alcohol led to speakeasies where organized crime figures like Al Capone needed a constant supply of talent to keep the drinks and illicit gambling going. This created a need for someone to manage these performers and book them each night, as well as orchestrate them getting to the underground operations. This led to the creation of a company by the name of Music Corporation of America. The guy who founded it was named Julius Caesar Stein. He was already a doctor with a great income, but Prohibition had made it so this job opportunity was more lucrative than his current one. Seemingly via the use of the Chicago outfit, they managed to extort, cheat, lie, and corrupt their way to the top, to the point that this talent agency had effectively retained a monopoly on all of Hollywood and show business. Their rise to power is straight out of the Mafia playbook. And I want you to think about this for a moment. A business with absolutely no barriers to entry, being a booking agent. Yet they'd consolidated power so much that they'd gained the nickname the Octopus because they had their reaches into everything in show business, and they had to be broken apart by antitrust. The full extent of the Mafia relations to MCA to this day is not known. Additionally, the circumstances that led it to becoming what we know now as Universal Music Group were highly questionable, with an active Mafia probe into the company going on in 1989. only for the investigation to get shut down by the highest ranks of government, with the prosecutor being completely defanged of his position for trying to pursue this case. Now, we will discuss this further, but for now, let's get back to the early days of Jules Stein. This man is essentially the father of what we know as the music business today.
You struggle to get the contract, and the contract two type of thing. Our first contract was 7 out 3.
That's crazy.
Okay, so I'm signing at 23 years old. I'm signing a contract that's supposed to take me into 37.
You're signing a contract for more than half your life.
And if you look at the shelf life of most artists, it's 4 to. So they're basically anticipating your entire arc.
That's so crazy.
So you don't have any leverage, other than that they want to sign you. You sign the deal, and then it becomes this weird dance of like, can I sustain success?
Yeah.
If you get success and you have leverage, they'll get out of your way because you're making them a lot of money. But the minute you're not making them as much money, then they step in and they start playing these Jedi mind tricks on you. We know what to do. The public's going to forget about you. I mean, I've heard all these things like, this kind of weird, like, yeah, you're in the room, but, we're the arbiter of whether you can stay in the room.
That's the weird position that record companies had for a long time that they don't seem to have anymore.
I would argue against that because
they still do.
Well, they've moved to a different set of circumstances, and I'm not as conversant as I once was. But one thing they do with certain younger artists, I think particularly more in the pop realm, is they do these 360 deals where it's like,
right.
If you get a perfume deal, like your whole world,
they own you.
We own a piece of your whole world. And fame is such a great quotient in American life now that you can see where kids would trade fame and be willing to give away like the profit part.
Well, they'll take a risk at the long-term ownership.
Right. So let me jump in there. So if you actually survive the cut, let's call it phase 1. You're successful, you're a name, and now you're in a place to either renegotiate or your deal is up or whatever. I once had a conversation with a very powerful music executive, and I said, and I was friends with the guy, so I was like, give me the insider psychology here. Now that I know the game that you run, what do you tell people like me when they get here? And he says, oh, it's just, there's always a price. So they know that even if you get through the matrix of the whole thing and get out the other side, that there's just a dollar amount that will buy you back in.
Whoa.
They're not worried that you'll go independent. And in fact, if you look at a lot of the machinations of the music business over the last 20 years, especially with the rise of the internet, it's to keep people in the system.
Yes.
They don't want true independence.
It goes without saying that once enough power is consolidated in any industry by limiting competition, the workers in that industry will flock there because that's where the majority of the opportunity is. Taking a look at history, a perfect storm of events enabled Julius Caesar Stein to have a near monopoly on managing talent in the music, film, and radio business. For one, prohibition made illegal business incredibly lucrative. The second of which was the Great Depression, which in turn shifted bureaucratic focus onto other issues. Now, as you can imagine, having the backing of the Chicago outfit made limiting competition in Chicago incredibly easy. It goes without saying that if you did business with a rival gang, the outfit was likely to not be forgiving. Furthermore, clubs that refused exclusive deals with Stein were often targeted to be put out of business. In one particularly humorous example, he hired a mobster to launch a stink bomb during another set of another agency. But what further allowed Stein to expand his exclusivity network was the founding of the Commission within the American Mafia. Essentially, after a large amount of bloodshed and infighting for power within the Mafia, Lucky Luciano ultimately ended up on top of the underworld around 1931. Luciano was incredibly intelligent, and he knew that taking on the role of boss of all bosses would likely lead to a shorter career. So he instead attempted to solidify the power structure within the Mafia by creating a board of directors to mediate disputes within families. The commission consisted of 7 family bosses originally, and after Capone went to prison for tax evasion, Frank Nitti would replace that role for the Chicago outfit within months. This, in theory, should have given Jules Stein a new network of connections through this newly formed alliance, allowing him to extend his exclusivity far beyond Chicago. On top of all of that, as a result of Al Capone going to prison for tax evasion, this meant that the U.S. government was now willing to tax illegal income, and thus stressed a greater importance in working with front businesses. Jules Stein was at the right place at the right time. To quote the book Dark Victory, Ronald Reagan, MCA and the Mob by the author Dan Moldea, which on a side note is a very good book, and I highly recommend that you go read it. Whether you like or dislike Ronald Reagan politically, all I will say is that nobody gets to the top without doing a few favors. But getting back to his book, formerly represented by MCA, Jones, like Duke Ellington and Count Basie, had left the agency in 1939 after Willard Alexander, a top MCA agent, had defected to the William Morris Agency. Jones told Morey that MCA controlled most of the big-name bands in America and Canada, and at least 75% of the entire band booking business. How has MCA become so successful, Morey asked. Well, they've devised a system of rotating bands in all of the places they play, Jones replied. The system's so perfect that without the MCA contract, a band leader can't make enough bookings to make a living, and the clubs can't get enough bands unless they sign contracts with MCA. This system that Julius Caesar Stein created is the reason that bands go on tour to this day. Before this, they all had been playing at one location for months at a time.
On special segment tonight, the new payola, a sour note that is tainting the rock music business once again. It was back in the 1950s that payola became a way of life in this industry, record companies and promoters paying off disc jockeys to plug new releases and to boost sales. Today, the practice appears to be back, with a group of independent promoters playing a major role. And federal authorities are investigating a possible mafia. Reporter Brian Ross has additional details.
This block on First Avenue on the Lower East Side of New York is a stronghold of the Gambino Mafia family. According to the FBI and New York City police, the Mafia capo who runs things on this block and in places far from this block is Joseph Armone, the man with the glasses, a convicted dealer who on most days can be found conducting mob business at a back table in this pastry shop. For months now, the activities of Armone and others have been watched closely by the FBI and police as far away as Los Angeles, as part of an investigation of corrupt practices in the rock music business and what appears to be the reemergence of payola at rock music radio stations. This was the Waldorf Astoria last month at a black tie celebrity dinner to honor some of the early stars of rock and roll. And among the guests, two of the most powerful and feared men in the rock music business. Joseph Isgro, who authorities say has described Mafia capo Armone as his partner, and Isgro's close associate, Fred DeCipio, who rarely does business without his associate, Mike, by his side. DeCipio and Isgro, each with his own company, are top men in what is called the network. About 30 men, many at this dinner, all known as independent record promoters, who industry executives say are getting millions of dollars a year from record companies to make sure that certain new songs become hits on certain rock music radio stations.
South Florida's hit music station.
Don Cox of Miami, one of the top disc jockeys in the country, says some promoters will do almost anything to get their records played and earn their big fees from the record companies.
Well, do you know how much money you make on having a hit record in this country?
Cox, who's had a drug problem, says he's had to turn away promoters who have offered him cash, cane.
You take this ounce and going home, okay? A couple $1,000. Here, you go take, you know, we can get more, you take this, and I'll give you a call Tuesday.
And what happens Tuesday?
They call you and go, how was that? By the way, I got this record I want you to hear. Now, if you take it, you got to answer the phone.
But they cozy up and they corrupt.
It's their job. Cox on the radio.
Cox says at his station, the music staff picks which records to play based on the music. But disc jockeys and program directors elsewhere, who said they were afraid to go on camera, tell the same story Cox does about payoffs of cash, cars, expensive watches, drugs, and nights with women sent over by the promoters. Another side of the payola scandal, according to industry executives, is suspected fraud involving the weekly Top 40 hits charts, which determine more than anything what's played on the radio in this country.
Okay, what was number 14?
This chart, published by the trade newspaper Radio and Record, is based on calls from 250 leading rock radio stations, reporting what songs they're playing. Authoritative industry sources say independent promoters have been getting certain radio stations to make phony reports, getting records not doing so well, not even getting played, getting those records on the top 40 chart.
It's a serious thing.
Ken Barnes, the paper's editor, says about 20 radio stations were put on notice for making suspected phony reports, and 2 have been referred to federal authorities.
We're a trade paper. We can't be a cop. We can't really police what goes on at radio stations.
By industry estimates, DeCipio on the East Coast is sometimes paid as much as $150,000 by a record company for handling just one record. DeCipio would not talk to NBC News for this story. And on the West Coast, Isgro has become one of the wealthiest men in the music business, driving around in his Rolls Royce, always accompanied by at least one bodyguard. Isgro would not talk to NBC News for this story. Isgro, shown here with a record company executive, is well known in the music business, and so is his bodyguard. But of 10 record company presidents contacted by NBC News, including the heads of such major labels as CBS, Warner's, RCA, MCA, none would agree to talk on camera about Isgro or DeCipio or the network of independent promoters, some saying they feared repercussions. Off camera, one company president said, "You just can't be in business without them." A second company president said, "It's obvious what's going on." According to figures provided to NBC News by industry sources, record companies pay independent promoters, many with mafia connections, almost $80 million a year. 80 million. And with this has come a climate of fear in the rock music business. Jay McDaniel says he was threatened by a big promoter when he tried to start a record promotion business, saying publicly he wasn't going to use payola.
Were there threats of violence against you?
Yes.
What was said to you?
It basically came out that I could have my face rearranged.
Just how important the rock music business is to the mafia became clear last month at this New York City hotel. Joseph Armone, man pastry shop, arranged an unusual meeting with the top 3 men in the Gambino mafia family, including the Gambino family boss, John Gotti, Isgro, who authorities say meets frequently with Armone and other gangsters, and Fred DeCipio, who, according to his lawyer, has never met Gotti, has met Armone only twice, and has no business relationship with mobsters. 1 hour after meeting top people in the American mafia, Isgro and DeCipio were at the Waldorf, taking their places among the top people in the American music business. Brian Ross, NBC News, New York.
Now, there are oftentimes a lot of misunderstandings when it comes to payola. You can't pay to have a radio station play your song. It likes to act like they have 100% organic come up, like all their success just came out of nowhere. But in reality, if you know how this business works, you know that it's a bunch of people fighting over the exact same listeners. If we are to believe what industry insiders have been saying, payola never went away. And given the fact that 2,500 text messages leaked to Rolling Stone in 2020 seem to show that radio station promoters were actively stuffing playlists with the same songs, going as far as to play the same thing on repeat every 15 minutes to reach chart goals. And then the text later showed that once a song hit a chart position goal, they would swap it out for another song. Not surprising if you ask me. Dare I say it, but it's almost like the charts aren't an accurate reflection of what people are choosing to listen to. It almost seems like a closed system of power where only certain people are allowed to cheat. Notice how when an Indian rapper buys views to break the world record on YouTube, he gets stripped of his title and they change the rules. But when Taylor Swift does it, it's completely okay. Notice how when Jay-Z tries to create an artist-owned platform to challenge Spotify, when he fakes a world record, his company gets investigated for data fraud. But when record companies partnered with YouTube launched Vivo in 2009, Vivo magically becomes the #1 most viewed channel on YouTube, with Lady Gaga's Just Dance magically getting 90 million views in 24 hours at a time when most of the world didn't even have smartphones. Actually, if you're paying attention to this chart here, supposedly this video was uploaded in June. Notice that it gets 0 views that entire time, and then the day before Vivo launches, it gets 90 million views in a day. Vivo hadn't even gone live yet. The same pattern of behavior can be found in a number of different videos. And I just want to point out that if this video's views were real, this means that it would have literally been a world record all the way until 2020.
You know, just when there's little contests and this is number one and this one wins this and this is the band of the year and the album of the year, like says who and why is it a contest?
So check this out. Do you mind if I explain it?
Please do.
Okay. The conversation came up with about the actual album, like Warner Brothers was interested if we wanted to bundle it, which is when you include the record like with a ticket, right? And a lot of people have been doing it, whether you buy a t-shirt and you get a record and it's a digital download link. And I was like, well, how does that work? And like, well, you would give $5 from each ticket back to Warner Brothers, and then you would get a record sale. And I was like, that doesn't make any sense to me and to Dan. And they're like, yeah, well, it's the only way you're gonna get a number one record. So if you want a number one record, you got to do that. And I was like, well, it's 1-to-1. Like we get $5 back, and then we get a royalty, and we get a ticket sale. And like, no, you don't get a royalty, and you only get an album sale count if they click the link, and we have a 50% click through. So in other words, we would pay $10 per sale on Nielsen SoundScan by giving the money back that we've sold on tickets to Warner Brothers, to our record label. I was like, that. At this point,
that is a crazy deal.
Check it out. We've sold 250,000 tickets on this tour. So we would give back 1.25 million. Our record advance for this record was less than that. I was like, if Dan and I were just on our own record label, we could give ourselves $5 per ticket and count, and we just take the money from the right hand to the left hand, give you a link. If you counted it, we get the sale, we keep the money. That's basically what was going on.
Now, what never ceases to amaze me is how people can take an incredibly subjective medium like art and then state that the one that did the most in sales of all things is the objective best, as if sales numbers are anything but a vanity metric. That's not profit. Like, we know for a fact that money laundering takes place in this industry, just like every artistic medium. This is like saying that the best piece of digital art in human existence is this one NFT because one dude bought it from himself. And my point in bringing this up is that there's a story behind this. But to understand how we got to this point today, you need to understand that the Billboard charts used to be based off of jukebox play data as well as data collected from record store owners. But can you guess who had a huge hand in jukeboxes? They were all cash payments. They could be placed on every corner. An ideal vehicle at the time to launder money. Now, out of the 4 big manufacturing companies for jukeboxes in America, Rockola was founded by businessman David Cullen Rockola, a mob-connected businessman who was later charged with corruption in 1929. AMI was run by Jake Guzik's son-in-law, Frank Garnett. That was until 1949 when it was taken over by the other infamous mobster, Sam Giancana. Many jukebox manufacturers didn't sell to bars and clubs directly. They were sold instead to regional distribution entities, and these distribution entities would sell to operators of jukebox routes. These operators would collect the cash, they would supply the records for the machines, and they would be responsible for the repairs and needed maintenance. The mafia focused its attention at the distribution level. This gave them control over the machines where the cash was picked up, and it also gave them control over what records went inside the jukeboxes. As the 1950s would pass, various mobsters built their empires on jukeboxes, with the Chicago outfit controlling 100,000 of the nation's 575,000 jukeboxes. As a result, this would lead to a situation sort of reminiscent to what we know today as an industry plant. If you recall, the charts were originally based on jukebox data. This now meant that all they had to do was put a new artist's records inside their machines, then simply misreport the amount of plays in the machines to instantly send a new artist to the top of the charts for as long as they wanted. Coincidentally, or perhaps a part of a grander conspiracy, during the 1950s, all of the radio stations across the nation began focusing their programming to the best music, the hits, with most major radio stations adopting the top 40 format. As author Gus Russo stated in his book, The Super Mob, It was Stein who encouraged fellow Lawndale entrepreneur William Paley to boost his new network, the Columbia Broadcasting System, by putting Stein's music acts on air live, turning the rigged top 40 into a national phenomenon. Now, on a bit of a side note, regarding this statement from Russo, I'm not entirely sure where he got this bit of info. Other books I've found seem to suggest the same thing, but other sources I've found list Todd Storrs, a radio DJ from Nebraska, as the originator. Just thought I should clarify that. Continuing on. Now, despite jukeboxes falling out of favor, that didn't mean the mob couldn't still manipulate the charts. All it really took back in the day was paying off a record store owner. To quote the New York Times, until 1991, the pop music charts were notoriously unreliable. Paying off record store employees with free albums, concert tickets, and even vacations and washing machines was the standard music business method of manipulating record sales figures. Even the Billboard magazine charts, considered the most prestigious in the business, were compiled from store managers' oral reports, which were inaccurate to begin with and easily swayed. As a result, this led to the introduction of the SoundScan system in 1991, which would only tally record store sales after a store clerk scanned the barcode at checkout for an album. And after that, the music industry cleaned up its act and nobody ever cheated again. Just kidding. Perhaps the funniest part about the SoundScan system was that data reported often had large discrepancies from the platinum certifications companies claimed. For instance, Michael Jackson's album History, when it was first released, it had been claimed 5 times platinum. But since each album included 2 CDs, each unit counted for 2. Yet despite this, SoundScan only reported 1.3 million sold. These certifications were based on the amount of CDs that were shipped, not actually sold in stores, meaning that a record company could just ship a bunch of boxes to a store and that would count as a platinum record. And then after a period of time, the retailer could just return the boxes for a credit. This meant that they could make it however many times platinum they wanted. As one article from the New York Daily News put it, the inflation of history is far from an isolated case. Often when an album by a major artist begins to slip down the charts, companies slap a gold or platinum symbol as a cover. In just the last few weeks, Warner Brothers had the Rod Stewart album, Spanner in the Works, certified gold as it plunged near the bottom of the top 200. In fact, the album has only sold 211,000 copies so far, according to SoundScan. Likewise, Columbia recently planted a platinum sticker on the Soul Asylum record, which has sold 574,000 to date. While Polygram stuck a 1 million unit insignia on Bon Jovi's These Days, even though the album only sold 357,000 units to date. Such discrepancies put Billboard in an odd position. As a trade publication, the magazine is obliged to print RIAA certifications, which often clashes with the far more accurate SoundScan data. As a result, Ellis says, it's time for the industry to think about the value of those RIAA shipment figures. Now, look, I could dedicate an entire episode to explaining how artists game the charts, but for the sake of not getting too off track with this video, I want to just go over a few for now. For instance, after SoundScan's introduction, record labels began holding back singles, then juicing the charts by building up radio play first. Additionally, there's stories of sweetheart deals being arranged with retailers, where they would send a bunch of discounted copies to their store, only for someone to come in that day and then just clear them all off the shelf. And then there's stories of people being paid off to run the same thing through the scanner over and over again. And there's other stories of barcodes being switched around, so then they could just redirect the sales from another popular track all into one. And lastly, the main method of gaming SoundScan back in the day was to send a bunch of copies to independent retailers. Here, each copy would be worth 3 on the charts. The idea here was to give a bunch of extra weight to independent retailers at the time because the SoundScan system hadn't rolled out across every single store yet. Then found in the documents of the Elliot Spitzer payola investigation, the documents accused Sony of keeping people on payroll to basically call into the radio stations and make fake song requests. Then also found in these documents, it's alleged that radio stations have participated in selling spin packages. This one's really interesting. I always wondered why radio stations sometimes just play like a whole bunch of songs in quick succession during commercial break, but they'll only play like snippets and then they'll say like, you're listening to Pay 0104 or something. Now, I don't know if this is still true today, but it turns out the reason they were doing this is because airplay monitoring companies detect that the song is being played on the radio, even if it's just for a short time, and then they count that towards the charts. While you may have heard that people lie and numbers don't, just know that sometimes we don't get the full story behind those numbers. Now, before we get to this next entanglement, I need to tie up the stories with Bob Keane and Larry Nunes. Then we'll also get back to the death clause. Bob had claimed he'd partnered with Nunes in 1964 when he needed money, and he wrote in his autobiography, "I had wondered if I had made a deal with the devil. I had heard that Larry had a reputation for being associated with the mob, and as it turned out 3 years later, a relationship ended in deception, dishonesty, and murder. I consider myself to be very lucky to have come out of that relationship with Nunes in one piece, virtually unscathed." After Fuller's passing in 1967, Delphi had been dissolved and Bob Keane had moved on. But it's worth noting just how bad Keane had gotten burned within his relationship with not just Nunes, but also his previous financier. Before Delphi existed, there was a company called Keane Records, spelled K-E-E-N. The story behind this goes, Bob Keane was playing clarinet in several bars and clubs around Los Angeles, and one evening he met businessman John Simus, who persuaded Bob to set up a record label with him. Under this position, Keane would go on to manage Sam Cooke for 3 years, who, I should add, he also passed away under disputed circumstances as well. But soon after working with Keane, Sam Cooke came out with a record that included Summertime, and on the other side it had You Send Me. You Send Me ended up reaching the #1 on the charts after it took off in 1957. At this point, despite Keane Records having earned over $1 million from sales from You Send Me, Bob apparently only had an oral contract with Simus. Eventually, Keane was cut out of the picture, and he was duped and received nothing and was left out in the dust. Hereafter, Keane would go on to found Delphi. Keane basically had an open-door policy for musicians to audition for him. One of the more known was Richie Valens, who after seeing short-lived success, passed away along with Buddy Holly and J.P. Richardson, and pilot Roger Peterson for reasons unknown in a plane crash after failing a takeoff. Now that being said, just because the reasons were undetermined, it's worth mentioning that the weather conditions were incredibly poor, and the pilot wasn't even made aware of the weather that they were flying into. On top of that, the pilot was 21 years old, was not instrument rated, and should not have been flying in a snowstorm. Now, as a result, Keane ended up owning Valens' legacy via his masters, and over the course of the next half-decade with Nunes, he built up a pretty sizable catalog, including Chan Romero, Little Caesar and the Romans, Ron Holden, Johnny Crawford, Brenda Holloway, some of the first records from Frank Zappa, and the Surfaris. But that being said, Bob Keane basically had his entire catalog stolen out from under him. As he wrote in his autobiography, "I was trying to resolve the dissolution of Stereophi, and towards the end of 1970, I finally got an agreement with Larry Nunes as to who was going to get what from the company assets. I was to receive all master recordings, including my Delphi tapes, and he got 600 copyrights in the publishing division. I signed the papers and went over to the local storage facility to pick up my property. There was nothing there. Missing, presumed stolen. I don't know who got the recording equipment, but it seems that the now defunct MGM Records was figured in the deal somewhere. MCA was even selling bootleg Richie Valens albums." The Keane story seems to be corroborated by the fact that several 45s turned up in 1973 from MGM Records. However, afterwards, Keane moved on from the music business after losing basically his entire career. Now, with Keane's story out of the way, let's discuss Mr. Larry Nunes. He was what's known as a rack jobber. That would be a person who maintains a distribution network of retail space at various mom-and-pop shops. The purpose of this kind of distributor would be to sell cutouts and overstocks for record companies, usually titles that didn't sell well or that they had overstock of that could be sold off for pennies on the dollar. While this might seem like honest work, this job was also a front for other illegal activity. For one, cutout deals allowed record labels to bypass the artist and not pay them any royalties. And the second use case for illegal activity would be to sell counterfeit records as well, under the cover of a cutout. As the LA Times once reported, critics of these sell-off practices have been complaining for years that record companies use the cutout and overstock designations arbitrarily to raise quick cash at the expense of the artists. They say that cutouts and overstocks often are routinely sold, bartered, or given away by the record companies to cutout distributors, favored retail accounts, and even company employees. In most cases, the artist receives no royalties. What's more, the Recording Industry Association of America, a trade group of the major record companies, contends that mass sell-offs create an atmosphere conducive to counterfeiting by providing illegal duplicators with a cover to produce large quantities of the recordings that have been sold by manufacturers as cutouts and overstocks. But in the case of Larry Nunes, what you need to know is that he was a cutout distributor who worked with two companies. One was MCA, and the other one was Roulette Records. If you recall that mysterious phone call in the middle of the night, where the road manager claimed that Bobby was going to see a girl named Melody, Larry Nunes employed Melody, and by all accounts, Melody was a lady of the night.
My relationship with Bobby primarily was to watch him and talk to him. I was like the go-between to talk to Bobby and see what was on his mind, what bothered him and stuff like that.
While Melody later claimed that Nunes was not mobbed up, it's also worth pointing out that Larry Nunes had signed an exclusive distribution deal with Roulette Records. That distribution deal was for the Bobby Fuller 4's last single, The Magic Touch. So following the money here, it takes us back to Roulette Records, owned by a man by the name of Morris Levy.
In a series of reports on this program, NBC investigative reporter Brian Ross has detailed several links between the mob and the songs that make the charts. And tonight, Ross has more.
This is the man federal authorities describe as the godfather of the American music business, Morris Levy, in the custody of FBI agents after his arrest just after 7 this morning at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Boston. Roulette Records is little known outside the music business, but federal authorities say Levy is as powerful as any big record company president, using his ties with organized crime to control record companies, record stores, and big-name performers. Also arrested along with Levy this morning were 21 others in Florida, New York, and New Jersey, indicted by a federal grand jury in Newark on racketeering and extortion charges, accused of using violence to get their way in the gambling business, the narcotics business, and the music business. United States Attorney Thomas Grealish.
A Mac 11 machine gun with a silencer is not used for target shooting.
The New Jersey mob investigation began more than 3 years ago with a man identified by federal and state authorities as a mafia boss, Gaetano Vastola, known on the streets of New Jersey and in the recording studios of Hollywood as Corky. By following Vastola and tapping his phone, federal agents were led to Morris Levy, to New York talent agencies, and finally to Hollywood, to the corporate headquarters of the huge entertainment conglomerate MCA, and what authorities describe as some suspicious business deals at MCA Records. The president of MCA Records, Irving Azoff, said earlier this year that his company was the victim of the mob and that MCA had done nothing wrong. But somehow, according to federal authorities, millions of MCA records by Neil Diamond, Elton John, and the rock group The Who and others ended up in the hands of mob front record companies, which were going to sell the records at huge profits to record stores.
The mob showed up. The enforcers came down.
Dennis Eisman is the lawyer for a man who ran one of the mob front companies and is now a protected federal witness in the case. Eisman says his client was beaten up by the mob when he refused to pay for a large shipment of MCA records.
I think it was to show him that if he didn't pay, he was going to get hurt, maybe hurt worse. I'm not sure if they intended to break his jaw and fracture some bones in his face. I think it was just to show him that he couldn't not pay.
And there has been other violence in the case. Earlier this year, a New York City policeman was murdered while following one of the men involved in the MCA deal, who is expected to be indicted soon by another grand jury. This indictment is the work of one of 5 grand juries now investigating organized crime in the music business. Federal sources say a grand jury in Los Angeles is investigating the role of top MCA executives in all this. Other grand juries in Los Angeles, Cleveland, Philadelphia, and New York are investigating allegations of payola, the use of cash, cocaine, prostitutes, and some mob-controlled promoters to get songs played on the radio. Law enforcement authorities say what's at stake in all these investigations is the mob stronghold in a business that earns $4 billion a year. Brian Ross, NBC News, Newark, New Jersey.
It goes without saying that the circumstances surrounding Bobby Fuller's passing are very questionable. But it's worth pointing out that had things gone a bit differently with Bobby Fuller's mother not keeping an eye out that entire day, then it would be much harder to argue the mysterious circumstances surrounding his death. This entire situation, given the facts available, reeks of a botched, contrived accident. I think some people think that the whole Jeffrey Epstein suicided thing is just some one-off meme. But I should let you know that this is a very real tactic used by organizations like the CIA to take out targets under secretive conditions. They quite literally wrote the book on this. For secret hits, either simple or chase, the contrived accident is the most effective technique. When successfully executed, it causes little excitement and is only casually investigated. On that note, when you understand the full potential of something like a contrived accident, it's very difficult not to be a conspiracy theorist in the music industry, especially given the fact that historically this industry has had ties to organized crime since the very beginning. And as long as humans are corrupt, I would say that those people will continue to rise to the top in those businesses, whether it be the same set of powers that be or another. When a contrived accident is orchestrated correctly, it can be difficult for the general public to understand what they're looking at is a hit. Oftentimes, people won't think twice to question someone who is labeled a junkie or depressed. But you should know that staging of these particular incidents is definitely a real thing that goes on. But don't take my word for it, the CIA will tell you themselves. An overdose of administered as a sedative will cause death without disturbance and is difficult to detect. The size of the dose will depend upon whether the subject has been using regularly. If not, 2 grains will suffice.
Man, I love your show. I like what you're doing, really.
Thank you.
Right? That's why I
Thank God.
came here. Fresh out of jail, I'll come check you out, right?
Right.
Why the bulletproof vest?
Oh, it's not. Oh no, that's just it's the new style. You've been in the can for a while. This is what everybody. That's what all the talk show hosts are wearing.
This is a new thing, right?
Yeah.
See, if somebody gonna do something about it, see, technology is so high, right?
Right.
So if you shoot somebody, you go to jail forever. So the kids, you don't want to go to jail forever, right? So they got this new thing out there. People sell them all the time. They got this stuff they call, they get blood from somebody with AIDS.
Yeah.
And then they shoot you with it.
Oh,
so
well,
the
that
death
seems
don't happen.
bad.
That's
Yeah.
a slow death.
Yeah. Yeah.
An easy thing, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh no. Okay.
Now, as you can imagine, Suge Knight's statement here obviously put him at the center of a conspiracy surrounding Eazy-E. While some people question the possibility of such a plot, others have pointed out that the rate at which Eazy-E went from being diagnosed to passing away was incredibly quickly. Now, while various people have shared their opinions throughout the years regarding that conspiracy, what's incredibly interesting about Suge Knight's statement is that it shows a familiarity with the contrived accident. So with you getting a broader context on the music industry as well as some of its history, it should now be brutally apparent to you how little it has to do with music at all, and how much it actually has to do with crime. Within the next installment of this series, we are going to be diving in further into the contrived accident and various other conspiracies that come from the music industry. But before we go, I want to ask you, the audience, a question. What contributes to the data that we saw at the start of this episode? Is it really just substance and mental illness that contributes to having your life shortened by up to 25 years? It's not like musicians are unique in this problem at all. Substance and mental illness are prevalent in all walks of life, whether you're famous, poor, whatever. Clearly, this data shows us that something is seriously wrong with this industry. And before we end this episode, I want to leave you with a clip from NPR discussing Mexico's music industry. I want you to pay attention to how different the discussion is over in Mexico.
From the year before. So my question is, are these musicians falling into what's a bigger pattern, or do you think there's something unique about the deaths of these musicians which may be attached to these cartels?
The same reason that other people are being killed in Mexico. There are entanglements. And
Personal entanglements?
Sure. A lot of personal entanglements. Narcotraficantes are often funding bands, according to anybody in the music industry who you talk to. In other words, actually giving the seed money for a band to get started, to get publicity, to get a record cut, and in return for that are frequently then expecting a cut of the money. Well, money, when it's changing hands, often can lead to misunderstandings and out-and-out deceptions. And the way that drug cartels deal with those sorts of problems is not by filing lawsuits, it's by killing people. Then there's also romantic entanglements. The closer a band is with that world, the more likely that a band member might, say, catch the eye of a powerful drug lord's girlfriend or wife or daughter. And all of these sorts of entanglements can create, very big problems.
Now, it goes without saying that the cartel presence in Mexico is far more pronounced. But it's honestly foolish to think that organized crime doesn't exist in every single society, and it's not something that really ever goes away. They say the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. This is Barely Sociable. Have a good night.
All right, fam. If anybody want to come up, I've dropped the link to discuss the 2 videos that we watched so far. And also, I have a 3rd video, but I'm going to hold on to that until Monday because I have the dogs standing right next to me looking to go to the restroom. And I've been up all day long. I'm starting to crash myself. So if you want to come up and talk, come on up. And if not, I'm going to bid you good night before I have a mess to get up. Peace and blessings to you. Thank you for coming through tonight. And we will see you Monday night.